How'd you like to be the Iceman? How'd you like to be the Iceman? The plumbers ain't in it, they froze them out. The grocery man is just close by, and the Iceman leaves him his supply. Then orders 10 pounds of coffee that's ground, 10 pounds of his butter at 30 a pound, and 10 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of tea. How many pounds in all, says he? The grocer then says 40 pounds are there. Well, it's 40 pounds of ice, so that makes us sweat. How'd you like to be the Iceman? Get it? How'd you like to be the Iceman? They are like policemen, all on the beat.
Really, the ice houses in Culver, their history begins with an Indianapolis businessman named Sterling Holt. He owned the Indianapolis Ice Company, which he started in 1876. He opened Culver's first ice house sometime in the early 1880s. We know for sure by 1882 it was up and going. The Holt Ice House was the first, located in an area known as the Hole, north of the outlet on the south end of Culver. We'll get more into detail on that. Some of the information we have, that's been gathered was written by John Houghton, who did a series of articles on Culver history in the 70s in the Culver paper, and one of them was on the ice house. And by the way, a lot of this stuff is on our website. So if you leave here and you're interested in seeing some of these pictures and reading more, a lot of this is on the library's website with a lot of historical things on there. John interviewed Bill Easterday back then in the 70s, and he said his father, Bill's father, helped in his construction project, that is building the Holt Ice House, by digging out the site with a horse-drawn scraper, kind of like a bulldozer, attached to some rigging so the horse could pull it across the ground. You may have seen pictures of that sort of thing. The manager of the Holt Ice House was Samuel E. Medburn. It was he who developed the ice business into a successful industry, as we'll see in a minute. What you're about to hear is the voice of someone who worked at the ice house. That's part of this. I guess I need to check the volume on that, but I think it's good. And that's Dave Burns. And many of you may remember Dave Burns. He was the fire chief. The talk that I have some clips of this talk he gave in 1984 to a bunch of Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts. And it's actually very informative. He talked about the ice houses. So you'll hear a little bit of that here in a second.
Now, the ice houses, boys, they've been gone. The last one burnt in 42. But this is the first one right here. Can you all see? That is the first ice house. And you know where Schaefer the barber lives? No. And those cottages there?
No. I think Schaefer the barber lives here right at the moment. And this is allegedly a picture of that first ice house. Anyway, he's going to go into more detail here.
Well, that was a real deep hole there. It was about 30 feet deep. And they started filling that with cobs, and evidently they put a sign up there, Cobb Hill.
Cobb Hill is filled with cobs. You probably knew that.
That's what my house was built on.
Built on cobs. And somebody told me that when they redid the dining hall at the Academy in the 80s, made it the Lay Dining Center, they did the whole renovation. Supposedly, when they dug under there, they found a lot of cobs under there. So this cob thing wasn't that uncommon, which is really bizarre to my mind, but apparently it wasn't that uncommon to make hills and build things up with cobs.
And then they filled it in, but that ice house sat there, and in 1914, the roof, we had a cyclone, terrific wind, and it blew the roof off into the lake.
Yeah, and I thought he said 1914. I think this may have been the big wind of 1913, possibly. There were actually two big storms in 1913, but one of them is the one that pretty much wrecked the lighthouse that was down at the town park, which was just put up, last year. Kind of not the same one, but a replica.
So they tore it down in 1915 and built a new one up there, where Hanson, Paul Cayley lives up in that area. Do you know where that is? That big hollow down in there? Well, that's where they built this one. And that ice house burnt in 1925.
Oh, that hollow you're talking about, is that where they were going to put those proposed condominiums?
That's right.
They call the hole?
The hole.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with what he's talking about. It's still a hollow. When I was a kid, it was sort of overgrown and there wasn't much there. But as you go south on, South Plymouth, let's see, I'm trying to remember the street name. That is Peru Court.
Big Street.
Yeah.
Dead ends into it.
Right, and it's a curve, and it's right on the lake, and there's a very nice house down there now. Anyway, sort of a deep dip, and that was where the second ice house was. And this is just kind of a map. This is an early map showing, that's around a little before the turn of the century. There's actually, this is the Indian Trail. They still had that on the map, but this is, it's hard to read, but that actually does say Ice House. So that was, I think that probably was the first one because it's so close to the outlet. The second ice house, which was the last one to burn, I'm sorry, the second lasting ice house, I'm kind of not counting the first one, was located on East Jefferson Street in Culver near the grain elevator, approximately where the Culver Cove is today. That's probably, those of you who remember an ice house in Culver, that's probably the one you remember. David Burns refers to this area somewhere in that talk as a swamp, which in those days it was. When I was a kid, it was a swamp. That ice house was built in 1908. And as John Houghton points out, that's where Sam Medburn's great contribution to the ice industry was made. The problem with Holt's ice house is it was cut off from the lake by the railroad tracks, which would be true of any building between the outlet and Jefferson Street, because the tracks ran all along the lake shore. That meant that the ice had to be carried over the tracks. So of course the train came, you just stood around and waited, you know. In Holt's system, the ice was broken into blocks at the water's edge, and they're loaded onto a conveyor belt, which carried it over the railroad to the ice house down to the lake shore. As I just said, that meant that the work had to be halted and the tracks cleared of any fallen ice every time a train was due. So that was kind of a hindrance. So Medburn realized it wasn't real efficient. So he saw that there was an opening needed under the tracks. So he bought up the swamp, built an ice house on it there, as we talked about down where the cove is, and he used the ditch that was already there at the time to such advantage that he was soon able to buy out the competition and become the proprietor of both of Culver's ice houses. So he buys the second one, which was in the hole, and he has the one on East Jefferson. So he has two big ice houses. After the Medburn Ice Company became a prosperous enterprise, cement channels were built to lead from the house under the railroad to the lake at each of the sites. Some of you may remember those cement channels if you've been around Culver. I think they went out when the cove was built, or the one that I'm thinking of did, on near East Jefferson.
The one down our neighborhood just went out when they built that new house.
Okay, it was still there until then?
Last fall, like,
okay.
or this spring, they just took that culvert out.
I didn't realize that. That's interesting. Here's a picture from the lakeside of the Medburn Ice House, the one on East Jefferson. You get an idea of the size of it. And of course they had storage buildings too. And you see the workers there, and he's going to talk in a minute about how the, this comes from the 1920s, he's going to talk a little bit about how the ice was harvested. Now this is Harry Medburn, son of Ice House founder Sam. Sam Medburn, that we've talked about, died in 1930. The Medburn name is just a name you run into again and again in Culver's history. Anyway, Harry took over the ice house after his father. Was also involved in a number of ventures and activities in Culver, including the Culver City Grain and Coal Company. So, and he's just, again, one of the Medburns that is well known. Houghton's research says that the ice was harvested by having a channel about 2 feet wide cut in the ice, working out from a point on the shore closest to the ice house. They'd start near the shore, and the channel would get wider to 3 or 4 times its original width after it was a few yards long. Further out still, it'd get wider and wider and wider, and then the field would be cut. And they cut it into sort of a checkerboard, as we'll see here. It was scored by an ice plow, which is a set of spikes, a little bit like a harrow, which left grooves about 1.5 feet apart behind them as they were pulled along by a horse. They used horses for all this out on the ice. The plows were taken back and forth in the same grooves until the ice was more than half cut through, so just back and forth cutting. The scoring was done in perpendicular direction, so the checkerboard pattern was made with each square 1.5 feet on a side. Each of these squares would become a 120-pound block of ice. Before you leave, you're going to hear all sorts of detail from Dave Burns that if you can keep it straight, you're doing well, because he has sort of, you know, you can tell he's showing the kids something, and we don't have the benefit of that. I only have the audio, I don't have the video.
Now I'll tell you about the field. Now the ice field usually covered about 20 acres. And what they did, they marked it, they had horses. And your lights, we had no electricity. So what they did, they had metal shields. They had metal shields 2 foot wide, 3 feet high, and had a scupper on the bottom. Do you know why the scupper was on there? Well, they put carbide in there, and this shield was slim, it wasn't stainless steel, but it's what they used to put on the back of mirrors years ago. And that was lined, and they'd pour a little water on this carbide and light it. And it was the brightest light I've ever seen. And that would burn for hours. Now what they did is, the reason they did this was because if it started to thaw like today, then they'd work 24 hours a day, work clock around. And in the house, they had one of them, just one. And that lit up the whole house. But we didn't have no electric lights, and then of course when they got lights, why, they done away with all that. It's like your old brush. Of course, that's long before your time too. 2-cylinder brush chain drive. They had carbide lights, 2 above on the windshield, 2 big brass lights down below. But there were carbide lights. Now,
You can tell the Boy Scouts don't know about the brush with the carbide lights, but yeah, I thought that was kind of amazing right there. How innovative that they use non-electric lights, use carbide, big metal sheet, and they lit the whole ice house like that, worked round the clock before electricity, and they had to. What's interesting is the whole ice harvest, and you'll see how much they harvested in a little bit. It all was done in a couple weeks every year, which is really amazing.
they took a team and they had a saw about 6 feet long with a guide, 2 foot. And what they'd do, they'd start down through the field first, mark it first. So this guide would ride in the mark. And then this saw, they'd go back and forth, maybe all day. They had several teams working, of course. And then they'd cut it the other way. And then they had, and I got 2 of them big saws and pike poles, needle bars and everything. But they had these big saws like this, and they would saw that ice because it cut about 6 inches deep. And that's according to how thick the ice was. And they'd cut that in cakes 6 feet wide and 12 feet long. And then they would float that down. They had a channel they kept open all night long by one of these floats. You know, when it was cold, because it freeze over. And they kept that channel all open that way. But they would float that in. And then they had men here, 2 men that had spud bars. You know what I'm talking about, a spud bar? They split that across way, this way. Then it went in between the railroad tracks down here. And they had what you call a needle bar, about 5 feet long, had a point on it. And that would break it just like an ice pick, you know, into cakes. They'd go on up the runway. But many times, John McKee, you know Hank McKee, don't you? Janitor up to high school.
Okay.
Anyway, his dad, John McKee, used to carry a bunch of halters over his shoulder. And a horse went in, he'd immediately go over, wrap it around his neck and choke him, he'd bob to the surface, put 2 plank under and drag him out.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And a lot of times they fell in.
The horses fell in. I've heard other people talk about that. When the horses would fall in, they'd put the rope around their neck and get a bunch of guys and pull the horses out.
Did they strangle them first?
I think they kind of did to subdue the horse so it wouldn't panic. You know, they kind of choked it into submission. I was just saying a few minutes ago that someone told me they have a set of at least a couple horseshoes that have specially made stuff on them to grip the ice that were used for the ice house horses.
But to watch this operation, it was something. They hired about 350 people.
Oh, my.
They come from all over, everywhere. Yeah, I worked there.
Did they use most of the ice on the lake then?
Do what?
Did they use most of the ice on the lake?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they.
So then the whole lake was the source of the ice. It wasn't just an area. They used the whole lake then.
No, just an area.
20 foot, or 20
And it would about 20 acres is what it took to fill a house.
I think you misunderstood the first question there. Yeah, 200 to 300 men. This is an article from 1895 when Culver was called Marmont. This is the Marmont Herald newspaper, January of 1895. During the harvesting of the ice, from 200 to 300 men are employed. That is when running a full force. And it's not only a bonanza for the laboring men in this place, but scores of farmers have the opportunity to earn a little extra change, which comes in handy, especially this time of year. Aside from the filling of the houses that belong to the company, there are a score or more private houses that are filled, which employ a large force of men. So this was a huge economic thing for Culver, well, 1882 to to, we'll find out, the mid to late 1930s, that was, what, 50 years. It was a huge employment, source. The business of the Holt Ice Company this time, this is again the 1895 article, is managed by Sam Medburn, who thoroughly understands the manipulating of everything to direct interest of the company. From $1 to $1.50 per day is paid to the men, and when we say about $15,000 is left here every year, the outside world can readily see the magnitude of this mammoth industry. And when the other houses are built, this will greatly increase the above amount. And when the nickel spur plate is run to Marmont, giving a direct line from Chicago to New York, other ice companies will surely locate here and carry on a tremendous business. We do know they ship to Logansport, to Mishawaka, to Indianapolis, to, I'm going to guess, just everywhere on that line, the Vandalia line going north-south, probably Peru, Kokomo. When I gave this talk in February, somebody loaned me a pair of ice tongs they used to hold the ice block. And it was from the Mishawaka Ice Company, and it said on it, pure Maxinkuckee ice. So we know they sold Maxinkuckee ice. You were just saying Logansport sold Maxinkuckee ice. And it talks about Indianapolis. A lot of these photos here, by the way, come from Cheryl Fujimura's collection, which she was nice enough to share. She's descended from the Medburns, and you also see the Ice House's mascot, Riley, there. He shows up again and again. Sort of a scarecrow kind of guy. There he is. For some reason, they all seem to have fun posing to Riley. I don't know. Of course, this is a shot inside the ice house. You see some young kids standing there. It's kind of interesting. I did read an article in the Citizen back in, I think it was the 20s or teens. It got so cold they had to close school, and apparently a lot of the kids went to the ice house to hang out and watch the ice being harvested.
Now, they used to use marsh hay. You couldn't use regular field straw. There's a big difference between marsh hay and straw. Straw was too dirty and it filtered down through the ice in the cracks. So use marsh hay, and there was no dirt to that at all. And they used to cut it. Never known the farm. You go west on 10 there, where you go, you make that jog the first to the right, where that muck is. Well, he owned that big farm right up the road there, 240 acres. And back there was an old lake at one time, Lake Maxinkuckee, till they drained it. And he used to go back there and cut the marsh hay.
Yeah, he's talking about, as you go west on 10, that first jog, to the north, there's actually a lake called Houghton Lake there now that the Nature Conservancy bought. And there was another lake, apparently they were called Manitou Lake. I've read about that too, and it was drained. But anyway, that's where they got this marsh hay. As he talks about in a moment, what was amazing to me when I first learned about the ice houses years ago was they kept this stuff cold, as most of you probably know, year-round. I mean, if you went into the ice house in August, they had ice in there that was perfectly cold and solid that they harvested in January. So this marsh hay helped keep it.
Yeah, somebody asked me, said, well, with that chute away up there, 40, 50 feet, how did they get it down to the boxcar? Well, I said, hell, you use your head. You'd come out, and then they had a chute run away down this way, see? And then it'd curve at the bottom and go in the car. But there was 3 men. There was a tail man and 2 side men. And they would grab those cakes and put them right up there. And I have seen them load 21 cars is the most they ever loaded in one day. Box cars, a whole train load.
Oh my God.
Yeah, there was Harry Hart's, Don, Hart's, he works at, his dad, and Don Bruce, and another by Irie McKee. But whenever the cake stopped, they'd have a struggle. As long as that cake was moving, it wasn't bad. But the minute it stopped, look out. Because she was lifting about 100 pounds or so. But as long as that cake was moving, they could put it right into place, yes.
Keep the ice cakes moving. This is that Marmont Herald I just read from. I love the headline here, Ice for Millions. Over 400 carloads cut thus far this season, not over yet, just so far. 400 carloads, and that would be train cars, obviously. And not half of the ice houses filled yet. An industry that is a godsend to the laboring men in winter. Indianapolis, they talk about that. Just a couple of little articles from the past, just to give you an idea, a picture of how much this, just the sheer volume of it. 1896, Maxinkuckee Ice Company by August has exhausted its supply of ice, so it was used up by August. 1897, 26,000 tons, not pounds, tons 26,000 tons of ice was harvested in 15 days, just over 2 weeks. Pay per ton for the ice was $1 a ton. Profit, though, they still made $20,000 profit. Think about that in 1897, $20,000 would be like millions for us. I mean, that's a huge sum of money in 1897. Yeah. 100 men have been employed at $1.25 a day. Cost $1,900 labor. It's not bad, not a bad profit margin there. 12 to 15 train carloads of ice were shipped out every day in April 1897. 1899, 15,000 carloads of ice. 1907, 40,000 tons of ice was harvested. The Medburn Ice House was filled on Monday. Let's see. 34 cars were loaded on Tuesday. 40 were filled Wednesday. You know, he has an open order for 50 cars a day as long as the ice lasts. I mean, this is huge. You know, huge numbers. 1908, the ice gangs were paid off in gold this year. Apparently that wasn't uncommon, and Dave Burns will tell you he was paid off in gold as a young man working in those ice houses. That's also the year the Medburn house was built at the end of Jefferson Street. I won't beat this into the ground, but you get the idea. 26 cars of ice in one day, you know, 1,350 tons a day the Medburn Ice Gang is averaging. Let's see. In 1908, J.O. Ferrier bought the Maxinkuckee Ice Company for $24,000, which is kind of strange. I didn't realize Hawk was manager of the ice company at the time. I'm wondering if that's the one on the south end, because I think Medburn continued to own the one on Jefferson. Anyway, 98 cakes per minute on the conveyor system in 1909, 10,000 tons of ice so far. You know, just on and on. And lastly, in 1913, the ice gathering season on Lake Maxinkuckee closed on Tuesday with the loading of the last train of cars consigned to the Cloverleaf Railroad. 20,000 tons, 300 cars. That's some of these statistics come from Judy Burns' website.
But to get back to this one, they used to rent a freight train, and it'd come in on the siding into this little building, and they'd run an engine off the railroad, and that run everything here to this point down in here where they picked up the ice, the channel. The channel evidently, the channel's still there, the concrete. Pay you to walk down there sometime. I don't know whether you can walk there or not anymore, where they allow you.
Just love these pictures. That conveyor belt system is incredible. I mean, it was like a roller coaster. You know?
But anyway, that ice house there, and they brought it in here, and it come up this way though, from this area here. You can't hardly see it, but it come up here, traveled down the chute, and then went into the houses, the black area there. You see it? And that's the way they filled those houses. Now there was a man at each door, each opening, and he's what they call a switch man. He would switch the cakes into the house. Then there was 6 men down below. They had regular shiplap boards, and they'd run that off. One would switch this way, one would switch that way. And then they had 4 placing cakes, 2 on each side. And they would place the cakes ice, which they usually tried to get 2 foot square, and up to anything from 10 to 18 inches thick. It'd come up here on a chute. In other words, it'd come from here, up here, and you've all been down along the railroad by the co-op, I know. And that's the channel where they brought the ice in. And then a conveyor belt picked it up and brought it up here, took it down here, and they brought about 4 cakes at a time in between it. It was 5 foot wide and 5 foot in length, and they were chain, a big, like your bike chain, only mammoth, foot. The links was a foot long, and they had 4 befores in between them. And they'd take 4 cakes up at a time, and they wanted to keep all the houses even as they could, and they'd put about 40 feet of ice in them, and then about 6 foot of marsh hay.
Of course, as you probably know, ice tongs were used to pick up and move the cold, heavy blocks or cakes of ice. This is a pair of ice tongs, and then this is a Culver City Ice Company ice pick. And then this next picture, see a couple workers using the tongs there at the Medburn Ice House. And, you know, I had some of those in February. I don't have any tonight.
I never knew a year that they didn't. Only one year they had to quit putting it up. That was 1937 or 1936. The last year was 1937. 1936, it got 33 inches thick. And that was way thicker than the cakes was square, and they couldn't handle it.
Huh.
So they only got their houses about half full. See, they, like I say, they've got, when they handle this ice, it's just like going down the chute to fill the houses. As long as these switchmen kept that ice moving, they could place it easy. But when a cake stopped, it was just like it was glued. Yeah, I used to sit at the bottom and switch all the time. But it did take long to fill the houses.
So I don't know if you caught what he said. 1936 was the only year that he knew of in about 50 years that they didn't harvest ice, and it wasn't because it was too warm. They didn't have enough ice. It was because it was too cold, and the ice was so thick that they couldn't get the saws through it, so they only got half a harvest. It's really amazing when you think about that. For about 50 years of Indiana winters, they had at least enough ice to harvest, tons of ice off the lake. When was the last time we had, more than a year in a row? I mean, there is definitely some kind of change in the pattern, but this picture, I have to tell you, wasn't taken. It was actually taken in 1906. That's October. That's the town park in October of 1906. It was one of the worst blizzards they'd had in that period of time.
That looks like a screensaver that was on one of the computers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the same little round stand. That in the summer they sold ice cream out of that. You'd get off the train and go get ice cream, and then go down to the beach. And it was,
Did they stack cake on the cake, and what kept them from freezing back together?
I think that was
separated with
the marsh hay.
each layer.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
a loose cover.
I think they did. That's my understanding of it. Yeah, because it would have stuck together. They used that marsh hay for that.
Could you maybe explain to the kids why people needed ice back then?
Oh,
I don't think
they had ice boxes. This is, you probably remember. You had to put the pan underneath to catch the water. You put the ice in the top. The old wooden ice boxes. Do you remember those?
They didn't have electric refrigerators like we
No,
do.
no
You
electric
couldn't make
refrigerators.
ice in your refrigerator.
You had to put the cake of ice, usually 25 pounds, in the top. Then that water run down, and you had a pan underneath the ice box, and a couple of doors, and then a big one. Maybe you had 4 doors. They had different types, but they were all oak. And I haven't seen one of those in years. Box. But the water running down through helped cool it off. But you had a pan underneath to catch the water,
And you had
like the ashes from your old coal
Yeah.
stoves.
How long would the ice last in a refrigerator, like a week or?
Oh, 25 pounds would last about 24 hours.
Was that all?
Oh, yes.
That's
Well, that's a long time for ice.
Oh, it did last longer than that, didn't it?
Well, it's according to how much it held, And if you could get a pack, if you could get a lot of spalls, what we call spalls, where they tip it with the ice pick and put it around it, it lasts a lot longer.
Huh.
But they come around through town about every day.
Obviously, as I'm sure you can tell, this is an ice box, and many of you have seen these, I'm sure. Milk or cold things would be in there, and the ice would be up here to keep things cold.
Now, in the winter, did most of the people get their own ice?
No, nobody got their own ice.
Nobody got their own ice?
Because they had a regular delivery. 2 teams.
So during the winter, they just take the ice right off the lake, and then during the summer, they'd use it out of the ice house.
That's not Culver, but I couldn't find a picture of an ice wagon in Culver. This is an interesting quote from John Bigley. In the early days, each home had an ice chest or ice box. There was no such thing as an electric refrigerator. A horse-drawn wagon filled with cakes of ice went through the area supplying the homes of businesses with ice. Each home had a card to display in their window showing the ice man whether they wanted 25, 50, or 100 pounds. So you have these cards in everybody's window of ice in their box, which was usually on the back porch. The iceman had a leather shoulder pad on his shoulder to protect him from the melting, chilling ice, which he held in place with tongs. So just keep that leather pad on his shoulder. There was always a following of children to pick up or to beg for small pieces of ice to crunch or suck on, right out of the lake. The iceman was an artisan with the ice pick. He could cut the block to the desired weight without weighing it. I remember Ed Hawk delivering ice for many years, and I know many other Culverites will remember him. Of course, Hawk Lake, that's the Hawk family on the south end of town there. This is actually a picture of John Edward Werner as a little boy. The ice business was always an interesting operation for the kids to watch, both in the winter and the summer, and I can remember many hours spent watching and playing at the ice house. Many times picking out small pieces of cool ice to suck on. In the winter we had to be very careful about the large open spots that were left when the ice was removed, or we might get an unwelcome dunking in the cold water until these open areas froze over again. If we did fall in, we just climbed out and went home as fast as we could, where our mother, who was glad to see us unhurt, would take off the clothes that were frozen stiff and replace them with warm, dry things. We must have been a worry for our dear mothers. Guess so. 1937 was the last ice harvest from the lake, and there's a little confusion about that because a lot of people remember the ice house existing for many years after that. They did sell ice, but as I understand it, 37 was the last year that they actually harvested off the lake. After that, it was commercially manufactured, I think in Mishawaka, but there were various places that did that, and then would be shipped to the local ice house, and you'd still buy your ice. This is an article from the Culver Citizen from March 24th, 1943. The Medburn Ice House burned. Let's see exactly what it says. They just give some history. The last vestige of a once booming business was destroyed by fire, estimated loss of $5,000. And that was kind of the end of the ice house era.
A lot of fun working there. I worked there in I started in 1960. And for 3 years, they paid us in gold.
Wow.
Is that right?
The same thing with Oliver Schilling's dad. When the old Model Ts come in, I helped assemble them, and he'd always pay us in gold.
Yeah, paid in gold. And thanks to those who helped make that possible. Again, it's amazing to me when you look at it, just what the volume. I mean, I think not only is the technology of it pretty amazing, but just the sheer volume of ice that was harvested, the number of people that were employed by the ice houses is just amazing. It's pretty staggering what an industry it was, how much it helped the economy, and of course it's
While strolling uptown the other day, saw Brownstone Mansion on my way. I stopped to admire it was simply divine, and couldn't help wishing that it was mine. A servant came out and I asked of him if Mr. Vanderbilt was in. I thought it's the house of a millionaire, but he told me that the Iceman resided there. How'd you like to be the Iceman? How'd you like to be the Iceman? The plumbers ain't in it, they froze them out. The grocery man is just close by, and the Iceman leaves him his supply. Then orders 10 pounds of coffee that's ground, 10 pounds of his butter at 30 a pound, and 10 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of tea. How many pounds in all, says he? The grocer then says 40 pounds are there. Well, it's 40 pounds of ice, so that makes us sweat. How'd you like to be the Iceman? Get it? How'd you like to be the Iceman? They are like policemen, all on the beat. And next he stops to see Miser Breeze, who makes a living selling cheese. Well, Breeze, old man, how many pounds a day? I'll just take a nickel's worth, Breeze would say. I'd give a small piece for a nickel, you see. As this place is awful strong, take a tip from me. You'd better buy a dime's worth if you've got the price, for your cheese can't live on a nickel's worth of ice. How'd you like to be the Iceman? How'd you like to be the Iceman? Makes lots of money. Oh, what a graft. Then next to a boarding house he'll go, leaves his ice in soubrette row. From every girl a kiss is his price. If he gets no kiss, they get no ice. Across the street is his next stopping place. On the steps is a maid with a smiling face, who yells to him all the familiar strain. Mother, mother, the Iceman came. How'd you like to be the Iceman, eh? How'd you like to be the Iceman?